Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of PhilosopherCitizen. My name is Dan Munoz. And this episode is titled Russia, Was It Ready for Socialism? But before I begin, I'd like to do a brief introduction, a preface to the series if you will, and it has to do with truth. I think it's safe to assume that most people view truth as a good, that when given the chance, people will strive for more of it. Unless, of course, that truth is antithetical to their way of life, in which case people turn openly hostile to the truth. But I'm of the type that would rather have truth than, as Sagan put it, a reassuring fable. Such is the purpose of this and future videos, to get closer to the truth. I say this is merely a movement towards and not the destination itself, because I know that truth is almost always more complicated than initially presumed. But the difficulty in attaining truth should not discourage you from actively reaching for it, postmodernist be damned. What I'd like to do in this video is to briefly examine a bit of Karl Marx's philosophy and how it relates to the conditions upon which the Soviets came to dominate Russia. I pick Russia to focus on because I think it's true to say that Russia became the template for the subsequent workers' paradises that sprung up. But it may be thought, and it may be fair to think, that Marx has already been thoroughly debunked, that he should be left dead and buried beneath the rubble of the Berlin Wall. However, since we're seeing the rise of politicians who openly label themselves as socialist, or perhaps better said, quote, democratic socialist, I think now would be the perfect time to dig him up. I will always endeavor to be fair. It's not my intention to be a sort of Marxist apologist or to manufacture propaganda, but I'm aware that I may inadvertently do so anyway, by the mere presence of my liberal bias. So it's important for me to say what this video is not meant to be. It is not an endorsement of socialism. I am not convinced that a planned economy could ever replicate that ever-changing diversity of goods we've come to enjoy in our current system. I just want to share with you some of the things I've uncovered when investigating the main objection to Marx. That objection commonly says that whenever socialism has been put into practice, only disasters, tyranny, and bloodshed followed. That given what we've seen, it would appear that Marxism has some sort of inherent flaw in it that makes it likely for tyrants to take on power. But to this objection, many people on the left claim that Marxism has never been implemented correctly, that those countries were merely paying lip service to Marx and not actually espousing his principles. I won't be investigating whether or not this is true. However, what I will be looking into are the prerequisites that Marx thought should be there prior to the creation of a socialist state. Because if the foundation wasn't there when the builders began to construct the house, can we really blame the architect when the structure fails? Now with that out of the way, let's begin. Section 1. The Foundation for Revolution. When it comes to developing socialism, it's clear that Marx did not envision implementing socialism in an impoverished country. That much is undeniable, for he says quite clearly in his work titled The German Ideology, to become an intolerable power, i.e. a power against which men make a revolution, it must necessarily have rendered the great mass of humanity propertyless and produced, at the same time, the contradiction of an existing world of wealth and culture, both of which conditions presuppose a great increase in productive power, a high degree of its development, and, on the other hand, this development of productive forces is an absolutely necessary practical premise because, without it, want is merely made general. And with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all that old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced. To put it bluntly, without a foundation of accumulated wealth, however unequal as it may be, and without the development of the productive power of the nation, what would then occur is just more of the same. What Marx thought was the best system, or at least the best system so far invented, for the accumulation of said wealth and the best method for quickly developing the productive power of the nation, was interestingly capitalism. He fell just short of advocating for it in the Communist Manifesto, saying, "During capitalism's rule of scarce 100 years, It has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalizations of rivers, whole populations conjured up out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? Furthermore, begrudgingly, he says that the bourgeoisie or capitalists can be given credit for destroying that unjust belief that some men were born better than others. That the bourgeois made it to where men obeyed men not because some were better than others, but because one had something the other wanted, as he says. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, and idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest. But the praise doesn't end there, for he says that the bourgeoisie can even be credited with civilizing, quote, barbarian nations, saying, "The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst. In other words, the bourgeois force upon the world an image created after themselves." In short, Marx thought that the capitalists played an important role, nay, one could say a critical role, in the development of the next step in evolution, which to Marx was socialism. Another prerequisite is that of the proletariat, aka the working class. They need to be educated enough to participate in the process of government. And it turns out, since the bourgeois at times find it necessary to ask the working class for help, and in doing so, raise the working class up educationally, politically, the bourgeois unwittingly, or perhaps maybe not, bring about their own ends, for Marx says, "The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry. At all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat to ask for its help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie." Which is a common thread running through Marx's critique of capitalism, that there are contradictions, countervailing forces if you will, which make it to where the bourgeoisie are sawing at the very branch that they're sitting on. Consider this. As the wealth in modern times is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, as barriers of entries are raised up ever higher and economies of scales are so massive as to be hopeless for individuals to compete, is there not downward pressure on the members of the lower bourgeoisie? Are they not in constant threat of being pushed into the proletariat? It would seem so. As owners of small businesses close down after the big box stores come to town and price them out of contention, it's true that some shops, if they're lucky or differentiated enough, could survive, but the rest may find themselves within the ranks of wage laborers. It would seem that Marx views this process as beneficial to the proletariat, as he says. Entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. With all this fuss about capitalism, is it safe to say that Marx would have thought the Russian Revolution of 1917 was premature? I think so. Even though Marx did say that Russia had an opportunity to bypass the capitalist phase, he also said that the opportunity was quickly fading away, in no small part due to the Tsar's push for industrialization following their embarrassing loss in the Crimean War. In my opinion, Marx spent too much time praising capitalism and how it would pave the way for socialism for him to truly think that it was advisable for any country to bypass it. It just doesn't make sense. But I digress. Let's look at Russia itself to see what the conditions were. A cursory glance at the output of Russia prior to the fall of the monarchy shows that Russia was the fourth largest economy in the world when using GDP as the measure. Considering the size of the empire, it's surprising that it wasn't a bit higher on the list. However, this doesn't accurately portray the state of affairs. I think a better measure would be how much of the economic pie does each citizen get. And for that I turn to GDP per capita. I know that this is a bit elementary and that things are more complex and nuanced than this. But I think it's telling that when looked at in this light, Russia then ranks below Cuba, whose output was tobacco and sugarcane. In fact, Russia made most of her money in grains, while Britain, France, and Germany were already well versed in heavy industry. Research done by non-Marxist scholars shows that Russia's income inequality prior to 1917 was relatively egalitarian when compared to the European nations at the time. This implies, to me, that the bourgeois class hadn't grown large enough to provide all the benefits that come with their existence. This is not to say that Russia lacked advanced factories in the cities. Indeed, they did have them. But Russia is a big place with a big population. It just wasn't enough. What about the citizens' education level? Did they have any appreciable amount of schooling, which to a degree the population needs in order to effectively engage in a democratic system? A system, as we shall see here shortly, Marx viewed as a necessity? The answer is no. 60% of the population was illiterate prior to the revolution, while at the same time, US illiteracy was only around 7 to 10%. So wealth wasn't there, education was absent. Is this enough to consider the revolution premature? Again, yeah, I think so. Lenin himself wasn't sure that things were ready for a revolution, as he said in a lecture to Swiss socialists just weeks before the revolution actually took place. Quote, "We of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution, but I can express the confident hope that the youth, which is working so splendidly in the socialist movement, will be fortunate enough to not only fight, but also to win in the coming proletarian revolution." But ever the opportunist, despite not being sure that the time was right, Lenin got on that train anyway and rushed to Russia once the chance to agitate became too great to ignore. And we all know how that turned out. I would like to examine one more prerequisite, and that's of the government itself. Was there any effective system of representative government available? I understand there was an assembly following the revolution of 1905, but was it effective in curbing any of the monarch's power? No. Instead, there was a czar who fought hard to maintain the reins of power, as evidenced by his words in a speech given to his nobility. "There have arisen the voices of people carried away by senseless dreams of taking part in the business of government. Let everyone know that I will retain the principles of autocracy as firmly and as unbendingly as my unforgettable late father." It's true this speech was given before the Duma, the name of Russia's assembly, was formed. But considering that he consistently dissolved the assembly whenever he disagreed with it, he must have meant what he said. Thus, when all the missteps by the Tsar caught up to him and he was forced to abdicate, the Duma couldn't maintain control, allowing for the Bolsheviks to successfully overthrow the provisional government, which only ruled for 8 months. We know how the story ended. Ultimately, Russia traded one autocratic ruler for a totalitarian dictator, who then distributed the already scarce resources by the only means you could get people to give up on what precious little they had, by force. But if I'm being fair, perhaps Marx is to blame for the injustices that followed, for Stalin may have been inspired by one of the more disturbing passages in the Communist Manifesto, which says, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state." Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. But to be clear, this expropriation of property belonging to the bourgeois was meant to happen by degree, as he said, democratically, by the majority, who were the proletariat, not by some singular ruler as it turned out to be, as Marx put it. The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. But that battle of or for democracy was then lost when Stalin took on power. The truth is, Marx didn't say much as to how a socialist state should be run, so it may have been irresponsible for him to agitate for revolution without having a plan for the day after. But as we all know of authors who died before they could finish their opus, I suppose this could be overlooked. Maybe. It's hard to say what the outcome would be if the assembly could operate as intended. Maybe protections against despotic power would have emerged. Maybe the entire course of history would have been different. But then again, given that Stalin was able to quickly industrialize the nation once he came to power, could we have expected the Tsar to do the same? Hard to tell. Without Stalin, would we have been able to beat back the fascist powers that emerged without the strength of Soviet industry? A no doubt disturbing thought. Perhaps it's best not to speculate on such matters, for the past cannot be changed, but I can't help but wonder. In conclusion, what is the truth? We've only just touched the surface. A thinker as profound as Marx can't be adequately described in a short 15-minute video. But I think we've answered the question asked in the beginning. That is, was Russia ready for socialism? And I think the answer is a clear no. No, it wasn't. But why care? Why does it matter? I think it's important because we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the politicians who take on that label of democratic socialist merely because of what occurred in the nations that claim to be Marxist, which if you look, you'll find all those socialist states to have the same basic starting conditions as Russia. If you're interested in Marx, it's best to go into studying him without thinking that his views were the direct cause of the gulags that manifested themselves. Those were the products not of Marx, but of totalitarianism. As a side note, it would also be foolish to think that Marx hasn't already affected our economic landscape. For those whom control the prevailing ideas of the time, i.e. those who control much of the world's wealth, have a vested interest in ensuring that the majority see Marx as a kind of demon, not as the late Enlightenment thinker that he was. A thinker that was primarily concerned with the question that should often appear in the minds of thoughtful men and women, which is, what does it mean to be free? I know we feel like we're free, but as Marx famously put it, for as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in a communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critic. A beautiful dream, is it not? To become a fully rounded human being, but unfortunately, trying to anticipate the needs of a society beforehand and planning for it is a lot more difficult than I suppose Marx thought it would be. But then again, how do we know what we need? Aren't we just following the propaganda imposed on us by advertisers? Would I ever want a can of brown fizzy sugar water if I wasn't constantly blasted by the message that it's refreshing? We here in the US enjoy a good degree of political stability. Despite what the news says, chances are good you won't be hit with pepper spray anytime soon. But that stability is bought and paid for by the bourgeoisie, who know that if we strip away all the social safety nets we currently have, if we roll back all the benefits afforded to the poor, there would be threats of revolt around every corner. They may want to push back the benefits as far as possible, but I think they know they can't abolish it. They will of course capitulate if the working class push back. Such was one of Marx's biggest failures. He didn't anticipate just how much capitalist societies would be willing to evolve in order to preserve their way of life. Russia was never given that opportunity to evolve. Socialism was pushed on a people who simply were not ready for it. Sadly, those same people were the ones that needed socialism the most. As long as the ruling class have the ability to sway the minds of people into supporting and advancing their way of life, we can expect that wealth will continually accumulate in the hands of a few. For I think Marx was right when he said, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." But at some point, this will become politically destabilizing, which I, and I hope most here in the US, would view this potentiality as a negative. This has been Philosopher Citizen. Until next time.